Today we will look at what it takes to get to a tenant-friendly lease. While Module 1 helped us understand what a tenant-friendly lease looks like, this module deals with the hard yards of negotiating a tenant-friendly lease. This video is a high-level overview of what it takes to get to that destination. In your client portal, you'll find an LPC user guide with far more detail about the lease negotiation process. This is just an introduction. We have 3 objectives for you as you view this video guide. Number 1, that you will understand that tenant-friendly leases don't just happen, that they actually get negotiated. Number 2, that you'll recognize that a tenant-friendly lease is the outcome of a structured lease negotiation process, not just a pleasant conversation. Number 3, that you will apply the LPC 4-step process to your future lease requirements. Let's start then by reminding ourselves about the focus and the content of Module 1. In Module 1, we focused on the difference between a tenant-friendly and a tenant-unfriendly commercial lease, highlighting that landlords and tenants have conflicting interests when it comes to negotiating lease terms that pertain to cost, risk, flexibility, obligations, and guarantees. This module focuses on the process that LPC use to negotiate tenant-friendly lease terms. Your lease outcomes will be much improved through applying the same process. Whether your need to negotiate a lease is prompted by a lease expiry or an opportunity for lease restructure or a growth strategy or a merger or any other business requirement, the fact is that tenant-friendly leases don't just happen. The slide depicts an office tenant contemplating an option to renew and the key questions that the tenant would consider. The slide also introduces the LPC 4-step process, which we apply to such situations. Now, although the process looks simple, it isn't, and tenant-friendly leases don't come easy. We will now take a closer look at the LPC 4-step lease negotiation approach. For the purpose of this brief overview, I will highlight how failure to properly execute any one of these steps is that lease negotiations tend to be unfocused, and the inevitable outcome is a tenant-unfriendly lease with commercial terms that are not well aligned to the business needs. Then it is over to you to review the user guide, which goes into far more detail about each of the 4 phases and how the deliverables of each phase work together and help to ensure a tenant-friendly lease outcome. The plan phase sets things up for a positive lease outcome, as the tenant is required in this phase to clarify their business objectives and risks, and then to determine their accommodation needs into the future. Failure to fully execute the plan phase is the most common mistake that tenants make. The result of this mistake is that lease negotiations tend to be unfocused, and the inevitable outcome is a tenant-unfriendly lease with commercial terms that are not well aligned to the business needs. When this planning work is done well, the accommodation brief will accurately reflect the future business needs, and the lease negotiations will zero in on the commercial terms that really matter, having regard to the tenant's business plan and business risks into the future. For example, a young, successful technology startup with both growth plans and significant risks may well focus more on lease terms that create flexibility. These terms may be expansion and contraction rights and an early termination right. Far more important in this instance than a focus on the face rent. The purpose then of the generate phase that follows is to create competitive tension by generating alternatives that fit the accommodation requirements that you establish in the plan phase. This builds tenant leverage with the lessors, including the tenant's current landlord. On the other hand, failure to generate viable alternatives weakens the tenant's negotiation position and leads to unfavorable commercial terms and a tenant-unfriendly lease. When this phase is carried out properly, it sets the scene for significant improvements in the lease proposals received during the assess phase which follows. The key activities in this phase are to get the accommodation brief to the right landlords and agents and developers for the purpose of drawing out the best possible responses to your accommodation requirement. In our experience, the main reason for failing to generate viable alternatives is a tenant preference to remain at the current premises with a reliance on a renewal option. Regrettably, many tenants miss the opportunity of a beneficial lease restructure by not generating alternatives and by not creating leverage. The assess phase follows, and the purpose here is to ensure quantitative and qualitative evaluation of the alternatives that have been generated, so that the recommendation for the preferred premises is based on facts and not feeling. This phase involves weighting of criteria that are particularly important to the tenant, having regard to their business objectives and risks, and then applying the weighted criteria to the landlord submissions that have been received to create an informed ranking of these submissions. Our experience is that this process generates evidence-based recommendations, which invariably influence and change the positions of executives as to the preferred alternative. The implement phase is the last phase, and this is where you get the lease executed and also get the premises ready and fit for purpose. This phase requires a detailed heads of agreement to inform the lease and a detailed premises project plan to ensure the premises is ready on time, fit for purpose, and having regard to the workplace strategy that the tenant established in the plan phase. The major risk at this stage is that negotiations break down after the heads of agreement has been signed and before the lease execution. This is a situation to be avoided, as the lessee will have lost leverage with the other lessors, and the loss of time will normally lead to the acceptance of an arrangement and terms that are far less tenant-friendly. In summary, here are 3 important takeaways that will help you ensure that you negotiate tenant-friendly lease terms. Remember then the following: you get the lease you negotiate, not what you may deserve. Secondly, always start with the end in mind and then negotiate until you get there. And thirdly, use the LPC barometer to focus your lease negotiations. What should you do next? Review the user guide for full coverage of the LPC 4-step lease negotiation process, and then apply this 4-step process to your current and to your future lease negotiations. All the very best in your lease negotiations.